There's a question that always bothered me. The final nail in the coffin of the Egyptians was the 10th plague, the Makas Bechoros, that every firstborn in Egypt died. The males, is a question of Midrash. What about the oldest child of the family? Not only the firstborn. What about if it was a girl who was the eldest? Did she die? Question of Midrash. But definitely, the male firstborns died during this plague. We just had, at the beginning of the Gemara Ezo Neshech, we find there's certain laws which the Torah associates Asher Tzichem Eretz Yisrael with those laws. The law of Rivis, the law of Tchelis regarding Tzitzis, and the law of honest weights and measures. The Torah tells us Asher Tzichem Eretz Yisrael, and the Gemara goes and addresses this. Why is it mentioned here? Because Hashem says that regarding honest weights and measures, and you're even in violation when you already put it in the salt, but you have a mind to alter the accuracy of the weight, because I, who was able to discern between the droplet of semen of a firstborn and not a firstborn, I'm able to discern between an honest weight and not an honest weight. I'm the one who is able, same thing. Tcheles comes from a snail that comes out every 70 years out of the ocean. And the blood of the snail, because it's so rare, it's very expensive. There's a dye which mimics that once it's applied to the wool, you can't tell the difference. It's called Kol Elon. So people would actually dye the tzitzis with this other dye, and people wouldn't know the difference. Hashem says, I was able to discern between the droplet of the firstborn and not. I can make that discernment. First takes money and he lends it with interest, and he tells the borrower, who's a Jew, that it's money, he's only the agent of the non-Jew. He's actually the agent of the non-Jew, but it's his money. I, who made that discernment, I'm aware of this. We have the Gemara. So we find that Moshe Rabbeinu, when he communicated the plague of the firstborn, he said, Kachatzos halayla, about midnight. But Hashem had said to him, Bachatzos halayla, exactly at midnight. So why did Moshe not say it exactly as God had said it? So Rashi cites the Gemara. Why did he say kachatzos? Because he was concerned that the Itztagnide Paro, the expert stargazers of Paro would say, because it's something which only God knows exactly when midnight is, they'll say it was a nanosecond before midnight or a nanosecond after midnight. It didn't happen exactly at midnight. And therefore, because he's putting himself in a position where it won't be exactly as he said it was going to be, therefore, it's not going to have the impact that it's meant to have. So Moshe, rather than entering into this issue where they'll have this claim, it didn't happen exactly as Hashem wanted it to happen, so he said about midnight. So he doesn't get involved. It's the Gemara Brachos, which Rashi cites. So I asked the question. We find that when the 10th plague happened, they said, Kulono Mason. It's even worse than what Moshe had said. We're all dying. Why? So Rashi says, because it wasn't only the firstborn that opened the womb of the woman, and it was the husband of the woman who fathered the child. If the woman committed adultery with 10 men who never ever fathered a child before, since that semen is the semen of a person who never had a child before, the child that was conceived from that semen is a firstborn. So many women, they had multiple adulterous affairs. They conceived children for many men. Therefore, there was more than one person dying in a household because they were all the first issue of their fathers. So they said, Kulono Mason. We're all dying. So the question is, if you have such staggering numbers dying, does it really make a difference if it's a nanosecond before midnight or a nanosecond after midnight? So Moshe, rather than getting involved in that issue, he said about, rather than saying exactly. I mean, what difference does it make? That question always bothered me. But as a result of the Gemara, what did the Bachatzos indicate? What would have that communicated to them? That God, just as God is the only one who knows exactly when midnight is, He's the one who knows what midnight is. He's the one who's able to discern between the droplet of the firstborn and not a firstborn. It's the same thing. Only He is aware of that. So it's to show that actually, not that He's a power, but He's a power that what time or whatever exists only exists the way it exists because He wills that moment of existence. And that's how He's aware of the droplet of the firstborn and not the firstborn. But so that was the value of the Bachatzos, to communicate that fact. But since that fact, because that would confirm that God is the creator, but since they may be off slightly, it's not going to communicate that fact. So once it doesn't communicate that fact, the question, maybe the droplet, he's not even able to discern between who's a Bechor, who's not a Bechor. Therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu says, rather than get involved in this, because it's not going to actually communicate that point, I say kachatzos. So it wasn't the devastation and numbers of dying, and what it communicated, that only Hashem is able to discern between the droplet of the firstborn and the droplet of not a firstborn. Just this is the backdrop of Vahi b'shalach Paro Sa'om. When it happened, Paro himself was a Bechor, was the firstborn. He lost the son. He had a firstborn. His son died. But Paro himself did not die. And it says, why did Paro not die? Because God left Paro to be able to, as we'll see in a moment, to galvanize them and encourage them to pursue the Jews. Because again, after this happens, Hashem hardens the heart of Paro. And the people are very wary whether they should go after the Jews. Why are they going after the Jews? The Jews borrowed the personal effects of what? Of the Egyptians, the gold, the silver, vessels. And that's why the Jews were originally hesitant even to borrow. And that's why Hashem says to Moshe, Dabin no bos neom. Please speak to the people to encourage them to borrow, because they'll understand that if they don't borrow and they just leave, they flee from Egypt, the Egyptians are not going to pursue them, as much as Paro wants to pursue them. However, because they took the personal valuables of each Egyptian, that's why the Egyptian's coming after the Jew. Because he loses everything. That's why the Jews were hesitant. So Paro then couldn't in any way encourage the Egyptians to pursue the Jews, but only because each Egyptian had a personal stake in catching the Jews and bringing them back. It wasn't for the sake of Paro. It was for their own sake. Therefore, Hashem says you borrow those valuable vessels, the gold, silver, and that's why they needed that level of encouragement. So they fled. So now we're beginning Parshas B'Shalach. Vahi B'Shalach Paro Sa'om, and when Paro sent out the people, if you notice, we know whenever it says and we'll see in a moment, it changes to Yisrael. It seems to be we're talking about two types of people. Very often we find when Jews are referred to as it means the ordinary Jews. Yisrael are the more advanced, the more spiritualized, the higher echelon of the Jew. But over here, among the Jews, they were all the same. He sent out Bnei Yisrael, or he sent out the Am. But it says, V'hi b'shal Paro Sa'om. When Paro sent out the Om, Lo nochem elokim derech eretz plishtim. He did not send them along the Philistine route, Kikorafu, because it was close. Proximity-wise, it was close to Egypt. Ki Omer Elokim, because Elokim had said, Peninochim on birosa milchama, because maybe the people, when they will see war, they will have second thoughts and they're going to return to Egypt. So therefore, he took them straight into the wilderness. Well, once they were there, they had no choice. They couldn't go back. But if they would have been closer and they would have seen the Egyptians coming after them, they would have come back, or there's a chance they would have come back. But right now, they're too far away that they would even consider coming back. They'll make the best of it. Let's take a look at Rashi. He did not lead them because it was close. The Philistine route was closer to Egypt. It would have been easier to return to Egypt more quickly. What war would they see? When would they be confronted with war? We were attacked in the desert. So where would have been attacked? We would have been attacked on that route, which was closer to Egypt. They would have taken that straight path. They would have returned. Here we find God took him the circuitous route, which was much more difficult to return. They said, let us point a leader and return to Egypt. If you were to take him along the ordinary route, the more direct route, there's no question they would have wanted to return. So Hashem took him the longer route rather than the ordinary route. Because if they said when they were in this wilderness where it was a circuitous route, it was much more difficult to return, they said, let's appoint a leader return. You could imagine what they would have said if they would have been attacked on a closer route. They definitely would have said it. So the question is, factually, God knows the fact, they did say it. They took the circuitous route, they were in the desert, and they said, let us point a leader and let's go back. So you might as well take them on the straight route. Why take them this complicated circuitous route if ultimately they're going to end up saying the same thing? Right? This question bothered me. We find by the Yam Suf that when they were caught between the Red Sea and the Egyptian army, they came to Moshe and they said to Moshe, why did you take us out of Egypt? Are there a lack of graves in Egypt? That's where they came with that claim. So immediately, Moshe started to pray for them. And then Hashem says to Moshe, is now the time to pray? Here my children are in a state of sorrow, of pain, suffering. Just travel straight into the sea. Alan remembers the Orach Chaim HaKodesh we always speak about. But even before that. But they said, Habib le'ink for Mitzrayim. I mean, they just finished leaving Egypt. They saw things which were unbelievable. They had no provisions. They went into the desert. They had the level of faith. And now when they're confronted with the sea and the Egyptian army, is this the way? Seemingly they're speaking out of line totally, which is not consistent with their being agreeable to go into the desert. So the Ramban writes that the ones who said Abid Link for Mitzrayim were not the majority of the Jews. There was a certain segment of the Jews who didn't have sufficient faith. Therefore, they said this. But the majority of Jews did not say this. But there was a significant number of Jews who did say this. So there were different segments of Jews, more greater faith, lesser faith, or holding almost no faith at this point, when they get challenged to this degree. Now, when they said Nidna Rosh in the Shuv Mitzrayim on the circuitous route, you realize it's the same thing. It was only a certain segment of the Jews. But if they would have been closer, because you understand, if you're a person that only speaks out of turn sometimes, if he has a so-called a solution, The solutions go back. What a person has faith and he sees himself in a position where it's too complicated to go back. As they'll say, they'll stick it out. They'll stay the course. The ones who have less of faith, are going to be the ones that are going to say it. If he would have taken the ordinary route, which would have been closer to Egypt, and first thing they're confronted with the war, they would say, we're going to point the leader, we're going back. It would have been a much more difficult test that other people would have joined this group, and it would have been a greater claim against the Jewish people. Later, when it says Nitna Rosh, when they were in the desert, it was those who had less of faith. So God said, rather, since we see there is already a basis to go back, when you take the circuitous route, you can imagine if it would have been closer, how many more people would have said, because the return would have been a lot easier to return. That's the way I understood it. So God doesn't want to put them in that position that more people should fail, that he wanted the majority to stay the course. There, he took them the circuitous route. This is how I understand. This is Chazal. Pen Yinoche Yachshu Machshovosh Al Shiotsu. We'll have a change of heart. V'yoshuvu Yidu Leiv Loshuv, and they'll consider going back. Why? By the 10th plague, it says, Ubelahei Mitzrayim Eseh Shvotim. With the gods of Egypt, I will bring judgment. So Rashi, last week's parsha, cites the Midrash that at the time of the 10th plague, not only did the firstborn die of the males, but all the idolatry. If a statue was made of metal, gold, silver, or any other metal would melt it. A statue that was made of stone or plaster just cracked and turned to dust. And a statue was made of wood, just rotted. That's Ulahei Mitzrayim Eseh Shvotim. Well, not only will I bring judgment on the people, I will judgment on the deities to show that the deities are nothing. Okay? So what did they see? They saw all the representations of these powers. They were nullified, that they had no power. To indicate that God is the power, and these hosts of heaven, these powers are only manifestations of God's will. So they saw firsthand how all this idolatry was destroyed. All of a sudden now they go to take the Philistine route, and they're exposed to new idolatry. They see there are other powers out there. I mean, here they were just convinced in terms of what they saw. Idolatry has deities have no independent power of God. It was proven through Ubelahei Mitzrayim Eseh Shvotim. Those were the gods of the Egyptians. Now, soon as they walk out, they see there were other powers, because these other gods were not destroyed. The god of the Philistines. So since it was just recent that they were out of Egypt, as a result of that, God did not want to expose them to idolatry. That's Kikarvu. It's been recent. Karv does no proximity, but it's been recent since they left Egypt. Therefore, God did not want to expose them to other idolatry, because this would actually create a question in their minds, which for them would have not been in the best interest. That's how I understood Kikarvu, but that's not Chazal. The way the Midrash explains the word Kikarv, Karv means proximity-wise, they were close to Egypt.
Rabbi,
Vayasev Elokim Esaom Derech Hamidbar, Yamsuf. And God took them the desert route, Yamsuf, to the Red Sea. So the word, what is the meaning of the word chamushim? So Rashi cites a number of interpretations. Either chamushim means only the fifth of the Jews left Egypt. From the word chomesh, 4/5 died during the days of darkness. As Rashi says earlier, who they were Rishon? Why were they Rishonim? Because they said we're not interested in leaving. They didn't want to leave Egypt. 4/5 of the Jews did not want to leave Egypt. So God says, no Jew remains in Egypt. The value of Jews exist at the Dakota Sinai. And if you're not going to Sinai and you don't have sufficient faith to go into the desert, you will perish during the days of darkness. So during the days of darkness, the Risha Yisrael, these are Rashi's words, the evil of Israel who did not want to leave, they died during that time. Only a fifth left. Only a fifth had this level of trust and faith to go into this unplanted desert. So when we deal with all these issues here, we're dealing with the cream of the crop. Those who had the faith went into the desert, despite all the challenges, they had no question. God will lead him, God will provide for them. So this is the higher echelon of the Jewish people. We find at the end of 40 years, after the generation who was deemed and doomed to die, the new generation exists. They're about to go in, and what did they say? And the water ceased, because when Miriam passed away, the bear, the wellspring in the desert, was in her merit. So when she passed away, the wellspring ceased. Right over, they started to complain. So which people are complaining? This is the generation who saw the old generation die to the last person, except for Kalev and Yeshua. They saw exactly that because they lacked in faith, the generation actually perished, died. The new generation said, a moment, there's no water, right away they're coming with a complaint. So here we're talking about there's the cream of the crop. And then they come with a new claim. The man. The man hasn't left our innards for 40 years. We're going to die from it. It's going to expand in our intestines. We're going to die. This is the cream of the crop. We're not talking about Jews who weren't exposed to the ultimate level and saw the hand of Hashem continuous, but yet they questioned. So the fifth we're talking about over here, this is the fifth who had that level of faith. And despite that, we find there were many challenges where they spoke out of turn, right? Which is something amazing.
Amazing. Rabbi, you mentioned last week.
Just to repeat Alan's question. He says the Sefarno explains that the reason that because the Jews already had displayed their lack of faith by when Moshe had said to them and it had communicated the four expressions of Gula, of redemption, and it says Lushamal the Moshe because kosher, they were short-winded and they had the heavy commitment of bondage, it fell on deaf ears. And the Sefarno says that because of that, later in the desert, when they're going to be challenged, they're going to fail and they will not merit to go into the land. So the question is, the generation after 40 years, they failed seemingly seriously with the water, with the man, and yet despite all that, they did go in. So why did the new generation merit to go in, although they also lacked faith and they were punished? Was the punishment of the spies much more serious and severe, and the new generation was not denied the entry into the land? That's his question. So what I'm saying is, and just bring it out with the famous word, which I've said in the past, of the Dubna Magid, that when we read the Tochacha, the Malkore reads it in undertone, does not read it with the level of audibility of the rest of the reading that's normally read. He goes into an undertone. But when he comes to the Pasuk in the middle of the Tochacha, V'zochati loch, Bris Avrob Yitzchak Yaakov, he reads it aloud, at the normal level of audibility, not in the undertone. Zachati loch Brisi Yaakov Brisi Yitzchak Brisi Yaakov. Why? So the Dumna Magid explains it. Everything was with an allegory. He says, what is it analogous to? There were two young men who were partners in crime. One was the son of the rabbi, and the other was the son of the tailor. And they planned this burglary together. From the first moment till they were caught. They come before the judge, and this judge was a very tough judge, and they were literally trembling. So the first person who comes before the judge is the son of the tailor. And he says to the son of Taylor, 500 hours of community service. So it seemed to be that the judge wasn't deal very leniently with this case. So the son of rabbi had a sigh of relief, being worried he'd be committed to go to prison for 25 years. The rabbi's son comes before the judge, 25 years of hard labor. So the son of the rabbi asked the judge, I don't understand. There's no question, evidence was brought, we planned this together from start to finish. And why am I held more culpable? And I deserve a more severe sentence than the son of the tailor. So he says, I'll explain to you the difference. The son of the tailor, who was his role model? His father was an ordinary tailor. What teachings did the father teach him? What did he see in his house? So therefore, I understand why he failed and was vulnerable to temptation to do such a foolish thing. But you, having such a role model, being taught by such a special father, how do you fail? How do you do such a thing? Therefore, your crime has greater liability than his crime. So the Dubna Magid says, the world, the nations of the world, they're in violation of the cardinal sins. Their behavior is unconscionable. God doesn't rein in on them. But we Jews, we step out of line. God forbid, there's a tochacha. The curses come upon us. Why? Es brisi Yaakov, es brisi Yitzchak, es brisi Avram. Where do you come from? What is your pedigree? Who are your role models? What is your tradition? You come from your princes. For you, this behavior is not acceptable. They, who are they? What is the capacity? As a result of that, they have less liability than you, and therefore, on you I rein in, on them I don't rein in immediately when they step out of line. That's the Dubna Magid. The generation who left Egypt, being adults, being the family, being the parents, at best, their children were young children. Many of the people after 40 years weren't even born when they left Egypt. They weren't even at Sinai. So when they failed, they didn't have the background that the Jews have failed when they left Egypt. As a result of that, although it was both a lack of faith, but the liability, the claim against the original generation was a much more severe claim. Therefore, they perished. And the new generation, although they failed and they were punished, they merited to go in to the promised land.